Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good to see you all this morning. As I've been walking around the vessel and watching other people walk around the vessel, I think we need to give thanks to probably the captain and also, the gods of weather for teaching us to dance, because I've seen some fascinating new steps as I've been around the boat today. And I'm seated up here, not so much for my sake, but for your sake, because if you had to watch me weaving around up here, it probably would make everyone seasick. So it's in all of our best interest that I'm seated for this one. This morning we want to talk about, obviously, Iceland, which is called the land of fire and ice, and exactly why that is. It's one of the most interesting, geologically and volcanically, one of the most interesting parts of the world. This is what the island looks like, and you'll notice some large white areas that are glaciers. Iceland is full of snow-capped mountains, volcanoes, glaciers, lava fields, glacial rivers, fjords, you name it, and it exists here. It's not a very large country. There's only 332,000 people who live here, and yet, again, geologically, it is perhaps the most diverse area in the whole world, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is and what that means in terms of the people. Interestingly enough, because of the Gulf Stream coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, which we help provide, living in Mexico, the Gulf Stream makes this a remarkably temperate climate. It's considered a tundra-style climate, but when you realize the Arctic Circle is just barely above Iceland, ordinarily you would expect this to be much colder. I had somebody on the trip say, I really want to go to the Arctic Circle. Is Iceland in the Arctic Circle? And I had to say, I'm sorry, no, it's close, but it's no cigar on that one because it's just outside. And yet it is a reasonably temperate climate here. Because of all the geological activity, Iceland is able to have a 100% renewable electricity that is very inexpensive. They have managed, Iceland has become one of the centers in the whole world for understanding the use of geothermal activity in order to produce electricity. They heat their homes with it, they heat their schools with it. It's a fascinating kind of approach. Iceland is considered the greenest country in the world in terms of being the most ecologically aware. In addition, they have no armed forces, so they are very much peaceful, and the country has really recovered very well. In 2008, they had a real financial crisis there, and people were expecting that they could be sort of the death knell for the country economically, but they've recovered phenomenally well. And as most of you I know probably are aware, we've talked to several people that have already been to Iceland before. It's become one of the most popular tourist destinations on the planet. It's very, very popular. It's a fascinating number of different things to see and do in a very small area, but it is a very diverse island. The reason why we have so much geological activity here and why it is such a fascination for geologists is because Iceland, there's two reasons really. Iceland sits right over where two major tectonic plates come together. The North American plate and the Eurasian plate meet right in the middle of Iceland. This picture is a man standing right where those two plates meet on land. And so because of those plates coming together there, fissures of volcanic activity come up between them. It's also the second feature that makes it extraordinary in Iceland is that they're right over one of the biggest hot spots in terms of geothermal activity in the world. It's called the Icelandic plume. In fact, that's the very reason that this island exists. It's estimated that between 16 and 18 million years ago, the movement of those plates, the hot spot of geothermal activity underneath this is actually what created this island. And there are still islands being created. In fact, down here, I'm going to switch back. This place, you'll see Sirtsi right there, is a brand new island. Sirtsi was created between 1963 and 1967. It started out as a volcanic eruption about 426 feet below the surface of the water. And over a period of time and for over 4 years, it continued to come to in 63 it came to the surface, and for 4 years it kept adding to it until the island ended up being a square mile. And it didn't exist before 1963. Now, it's not going to last forever because it's volcanic, which means it's not that hard and it is being eroded by the ocean waves and whatnot. But they're still making new islands in this part of the world because of the volcanic activity. In addition, I'm going to talk about the the thermal springs in a few minutes. The most popular tourist destination, and we've talked about it already this morning, is the Blue Lagoon, which is a body of thermal water that you can go in cold weather and soak in nice hot water, and people come from all over to experience the Blue Lagoon. Well, the Iceland also has a great many geysers. In fact, the very word geyser is an Icelandic word. One of the largest of the geysers in Iceland is called the geyser. And it's the where we get the name for geysers, wherever else in the world you go. And by the way, I'll just mention, since we've been talking about Norse mythology, the Surtsey Island is named after Surtur, who is a fire giant who has a flaming sword and one of the leaders of the rebellion of the giants against the gods, the Aesir gods, in the Ragnarok, the end of the world. So they named this after a fire giant from Norse mythology. Obviously, there is a lot of volcanic activity. As we've just said, there's a high concentration of active volcanoes. In fact, there are 30 active volcano systems just on this one island. 13 of those have erupted since the island since people first came here, since there were the first human inhabitants. The most active and volatile volcano is called Grimsvötn. And over the past 500 years, 1/3 of all the global output of lava, the whole planet, 1/3 of all the lava has been on this small island of Iceland. And so continue to be very, very active. In fact, the most fatal volcanic eruption in history in the whole planet was in 1783 and 84. It's the Skraftalarder. You have to forgive my pronunciation of Icelandic. It's been a long time. I've never been to Iceland. I don't know how to speak Icelandic. But the Skraftalarder, or fires of Skrafta, in 1783 erupted. It's southwest of the largest of the glaciers on the island. And in the process of doing that, 1/4 of the population in 1783 and 4 of Iceland were killed. So 1 out of every 4 people died because of that eruption. And it wasn't so much because of the lava or the direct cause, it was the indirect cause. There was an enormous amount of poisonous gases and ash that came out. A lot of the livestock were killed. It changed the climate for many, many years there. And it was a result of all those secondary effects that 1/4 of the people in Iceland died in 1783 and 4 because of that. But in addition, it had a global impact. The outpouring of sulfur dioxide and other poisonous gases and ash dropped the overall temperature on the planet by several degrees for quite a few years. It was a major climate effect. It led to crop failures throughout Europe. It led to droughts in India, and it's estimated that a total of about 6 million people probably died because of this Icelandic volcano in 1783 and 84. So that's considered one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in history, not the deadliest, but one of the deadliest ever. Of course, most of you probably remember in 2010, there was an eruption of the volcano, I'll get this right, Eyjafjallajökull. Jökull is the Icelandic word for a volcano, but Eyjafjallajökull was a volcano that erupted in 2010, and it stopped all the transcontinental air traffic coming from Europe. You couldn't fly to Europe or from Europe directly unless you went around the long way because of all the ash that was in the air. This was a major economic factor, and it lasted for several weeks that flights could not get anywhere close to Iceland because of all of that. So it's had significant effects. In 2011, there was another major eruption of the Grimsvötn, which is the largest of the volcanoes. And again, one of the strange things about the volcanoes in Iceland is many of them are actually underneath the glaciers. And what happens is when the volcanoes erupt underneath the glaciers, they end up creating these enormous flash floods, these rivers that are created from the heat meeting the water. And so in 2011, when Grimsvötn, which is underneath the largest glacier in Iceland, when it erupted, there were thousands of tons of ash cast into the sky, enormous rushes of rivers. Now, they understand this well enough that they don't usually put houses in the path of where those rivers could be because they know where the volcanoes are. And yet they were fearful in 2011 they were going to have another problem with not being able to have air traffic. But fortunately, it didn't turn out as bad in terms of ash flow. This is the most recent of the major volcanic. This is a satellite image of it, and you see the red spots. This down in the lower left-hand corner, this is actually the major lava spout. That's where it's coming out. But all of the other orange areas, this is 20 miles away. And what happens is that as the lava comes out and hits the cool air, because again, this is surrounded by glacier, it forms these lava tubes or tunnels. So lava that can flow through those tunnels and sometimes go as far as 20 miles before it then breaks out and is visible again. This area, this black area, is the size of Manhattan Island. So it's very significant in terms of its size. This was the Holuhraun eruption, which is the largest lava eruption in the last several centuries in the whole world. The amount of lava that was poured out created a 33, and it erupted for 6 months, and it created 33 square miles of lava field just from this eruption. And at the height, and this is in 2014 and 2015, from August until January, August 2014 to January 2015, at the height of the eruption, it was pouring out 2,500 cubic feet of lava per second, which means that it was 4.3 million cubic meters of lava per day at the height of the eruption, which is why it created a lava field that, as I say, is 33 square miles in size, the same size as Manhattan Island. And it did that in about a 6-month period, so you can imagine how much lava is coming out of this. It began, in addition, because it's a volcanic area, they have a lot of earthquakes in Iceland, and it began with a whole series of heavy earthquakes, a swarm of heavy earthquakes that preceded the actual eruption. And then they had multiple eruptions from a lava dike that was over 40 kilometers long. It was a long ridge that was pouring lava. You sort of get the image of it down here. This is from that eruption. It poured an enormous amount, and this was the biggest concern, an enormous amount of sulfur dioxide, SO2, was poured into the atmosphere because the nature of these volcanic eruptions is they create a lot of hot, poisonous gases that come from underneath. In fact, one of the great dangers during the actual occurrence of a volcano eruption is what's called a hyperplastic flow, a flow of hot air and gases that will literally, which runs much faster than you can or that your vehicle can. And so often, I've seen some video of volcanologists who were studying volcanoes in the South Pacific, for instance, and they're videotaping as a volcano erupts, and they can see, because it bends the trees and everything, they can see the hyperplastic flow coming toward them, and they were killed. I mean, they filmed this, and the film was left available, but the people who were doing this didn't live because you can't outrun those things. So this whole pouring out of poisonous gases very quickly is one of the things that's dangerous. And this produced, in 2014, the most volcanic lava since any eruption since that 1783 volcano that I mentioned to you. Now this same outline, this black outline, in January of 2015, when it was still the last month when it was actively erupting, they did a satellite image of all of Iceland, and it was January, and so it's all covered in snow, except for one place. Does that shade look familiar? All right, that's the same image. This is a volcanic spot right in the middle of snow-covered Iceland. And so this is the size of Manhattan Island. Now that we're looking at this frozen picture of Iceland, I will switch gears to the other major kind of geological or geographic, I guess it's not geological so much, feature of Iceland, and that is the glaciers. The fact that there are just over 11% of all of the land of Iceland is covered with glaciers. The largest one is the Vatnajökull, and Vatnajökull is an enormous glacier, and again, it's the one, in fact, it's right here, because this volcano is underneath it. So it melted the ice above it when the volcanic eruption occurred. They call these melted glacial waters, these rivers that it creates, the Jökulhlauts. And the Jökulhlauts are very, very dangerous, but they're aware of where the primary active volcanoes are, and they try to plan around that, but they're not always successful in that. As I say, over 11% of the land area of the country, or over 6,000 square miles, are covered with glaciers. Interestingly, there has been a reduction in glacial amount in recent years. In order for something to be considered a glacier, it has to have a minimum amount of ice involved. And most people think that glaciers are frozen rivers, because if you've ever seen a glacier up front, you may have gone to one when we were at Olden in Norway. It looks like a river, but in fact, it's not made from river water. But a glacier is made because when snow falls and it remains for a long period of time and it gets packed down, it becomes ice. And so glaciers are actually long period of ice pack or snow pack that is turned into ice and looks like a river. And one of the aspects of glaciers that's so interesting is they have so much mass that they actually move under their own weight. They will move down hills, down valleys, because they have enough weight behind it. But there have been a couple of glaciers in Iceland that have lost, because of climate change, have lost enough of their ice that they're no longer considered glaciers. There is one that was called the Oakjökull. Jökull is the Icelandic word for glacier. It was the Oakjökull, but then it reduced in size because of warming, and so now it's just called Oak. It's no longer a jökull. It's no longer a glacier. So they're having a lot of change here as well. The glaciers constitute the highest levels in some of the mountains in Iceland, and some of them go almost 7,000 feet above sea level. And again, a glacier is a large, persistent, meaning it remains for a long period of time, block of ice made from compressed snow. And the ability to move over a period of time, it looks like they're just very slow-moving rivers. Because of all the activity in the volcanic activity, another feature, here you get some of the glacier effects. It looks like a giant river flowing down. These are all some of the major glaciers that exist. This is the largest one here. You get glacial runoff and then ice caves, because as they move and they break apart, they have openings in them. You can do tours of ice caves in the glaciers because of the, not something that I want to do, but if you all want to, you could probably make arrangements when you're in Iceland to do that, to visit some of the ice caves in some of the glaciers. Now, because of the volcanic activity, they end up with the phenomena of hot springs or geothermal waters. As I said before, the Blue Lagoon is an example of this. It is the most popular tourist attraction in Iceland. This is what it looks like. And it's fascinating to me that the lifeguard has to wear Arctic gear because he's not actually in the hot water, while everyone else is in their bathing suits down in the water. There are a lot of geysers. As I said, geyser is a word that comes from Icelandic. And this is a Blue Lagoon as well. And right next to the Blue Lagoon, there is a major geothermal plant that is drawing heat and then electricity from the geothermal activity. Up until the 1970s, Iceland was like every place else. They were heavily dependent upon oil and other petroleum products in order to heat their houses and to run everything, to produce electricity. Well, in the 70s, when we had the oil crisis, they decided they better do something about it. And so Iceland was very disciplined to create a thermal industry where they learned to efficiently use the heat from underground to create electricity. First, to heat their homes. They were directing it in communities to schools. Schools were the first place they did it. and then they were heating private homes, and then they began to use it to produce electricity, so that now 100% of all of the electricity in Iceland is from renewable resources. It's not from gas or oil, it's from geothermal and from hydro. Only about 30% of their electricity comes from geothermal. The rest of it comes from hydro dams, but they've got a lot of water, a lot of flowing water, and so dams are very efficient there. If you take into account the home heating kind of thing, then half of all of their energy use is met by the geothermal industry there. And they've become the world's experts in this. People from Iceland are now working in China, in Nevada, in various places around the world that have geothermal activity in order to help them figure out how they can efficiently and effectively use that geothermal energy in order to provide themselves with replacement for fossil fuels. They've even developed in Iceland, it's kind of a cultural facet to it. They have what they call hot springs bread, or a haverbraut, which is a special kind of bread that they make using the heat from the hot springs. And so they've developed all sorts of different ways that they can use this hot water as they go along. Reykjavik today is the largest geothermal heating area in the world. The whole city is heated with geothermal, and yet they feel like only a small fraction of their overall potential has been tapped. They feel as though right now they're creating about 4 terawatts of electricity, and they have the potential of producing 30 terawatts. A terawatt is 1 trillion watts. So they believe once they gain efficiency and learn more and more how to do this well, they'll be able to be even more, they'll be producing a lot more energy than they need, and potentially they could even export energy from here based upon what they learned about geothermal activity. And of course, the country is beautiful. You get the combination of volcano and snow and glaciers, the runoff from the volcanoes, all added to a fairly temperate climate because they are warmed by the Gulf Stream, and you get extraordinary beauty. Iceland is one of the reasons it's such an attraction to tourists nowadays, is because it's considered one of the most beautiful places in the world. A rugged beauty, it's not a refined kind of beauty, but a rugged beauty in the mountains, glaciers, volcanoes, etc.